Have you ever met someone whose face looked like a map of a vanished world? Last time, we wandered through the wild New Zealand bush, slept under cherry trees with Byron hidden in a violin case, and watched Maori girls dance like mermaids in an ocean of moonlight. We listened as Mako, with her chin on her knees and stars in her eyes, summoned Takaroa from the sea and a girl from the heart of a little bird. For a moment, fairy tale and forest, lake and sky were all one breath. Tonight, we go back to that world, to the tattooed chiefs who remember when the land was truly Maori. Two songs that still carry the echo of old battles and broken hearts. Two wanderers with only a pound in their pocket and a fiddle on their back, gambling everything on beauty, on stories, on the kindness of strangers. Stay with this journey a little longer, because behind the romance of bush tracks and lake reflections lies something more quiet and unsettling. A question that haunts every vagabond soul. What do we really find when we walk so far from home that the only familiar thing left is the sound of our own heart? While sweetly some play on soft flutes and lyres, I, by gum, beat with delight the big barbarian drum. Before this drama of the great limelight, of stars and dancing shadows infinite, best part of truth is hidden in the heart of humanity. How different is that which we reveal from that which we think of in silence? Our outward demeanor is civilization. Our hidden inward cravings are barbarism. To some extent, these pages will deal with the savage instincts of the natives of tropical isles, and with men who have found refuge in those lands, far from the cities of the Western world. To tell you of the semi-heathen is much akin to telling you of ourselves. For are not the barbarian instincts which we all have within us our own tiny, savage, dusky children? We chide them for their waywardness, but do we not encourage them in secret, as the savage outwardly does, expressing joyously that which we are ashamed of? One has the virtue of truth, and the other of polished deceit. Notwithstanding this, I think civilization the best of all possible things. Truly, however, civilization is built on a quicksand. And now that the Fijian forest battles and cannibalistic feasts have become fierce and gruesome history, the great tribalistic clash of nations, in full swing as I write, reveals more than words the relentless link that binds white and brown men together. Once when I was wandering in the Marcassin group, I suddenly came across the ruins of an old cannibalistic amphitheater, standing lonely by the forest palms. The stone cooling shelves, whereon once lay the dead men and women in hot weather, were still intact, but thickly overgrown with moss and sheltered by bamboos. The festival arena and its surroundings of artistic savagery were all gone. The barbarian log walls had fallen. Wild tropical vines, smothered with wild flowers, thickly covered all that tomb-like place, where savages once ate their foes and whirled in the cannibalistic dance, revealing the shapes of the stone edifice, the pai, 15 the turrets, and log walls. The savage tribes, with their sighs and laughter, lay dead, silent dust in the forest, hard by. I looked up through that amphitheater-shaped growth. It was night. I saw the stars glimmering through the dark palms as the trade wind stirred them. Now I think those vanished walls were as civilization, and the green clinging boughs remaining and revealing the amphitheater's shape sad humanity clinging to the best it has left. The simile may not be perfect, but neither is anything that is human. But I must ramble on my way, for I am now well on the road to my reminiscences of Fiji. Years ago, just off the Rewa River, which is navigable 50 or 60 miles inland, there was a wooden shanty. It had 2 compartments. The walls were made of cocoa palm stems, tied strongly together with wild hemp. Situated at a lonely spot, surrounded by primeval vegetation, cocoa palms, baka trees, and wild tropical twining vines, it was eminently suitable for the purpose for which it was used. For in its snug rooms lived the men who were members of the charity organization of the South Seas. The officials did not run the place on Western lines, for it was a true home for the fallen. No questions were asked when suddenly the hunted, haggard, unshaved face appeared. To be hunted was a sufficient reference to enable the applicant to be at once enrolled as a member. 12 fierce-eyed, rough-looking men, attired in big-brimmed hats and belted trousers, would greet the new arrival, and with the instinct of bloodhounds stare, and reckon up the new visitor's pedigree. If he looked sufficiently villainous and haggard, and pathetically told the woe of some criminal ambition that had been frustrated by the vigilant eye of civilization, he was immediately given the first-grade diploma, a tin mug of the best Fijian rum. If he still possessed any part of the spoil, he could have an extra mugful, for the organization was not a rich one. A little offside room was artistically arranged, a small looking glass, brush and comb, and all those things that tell of gentleness and frailness completed its furniture. There it was, silent, clean, tenantless and ready, for often from other lands, with the spoil, the missing man would arrive with the cause of his downfall weeping beside him, and in there she slept. No one could tell the individual histories of these men. It will be sufficient to say that they were there. Ere I proceed, I must tell you that when I speak of the organization's whereabouts, I mislead you in the name only. The true vicinity characteristically resembles my description. It is obvious that to be faithful to those who befriended me, I must be secretive in some of the details which tell of this isle of the South Seas, where men sought, and probably still seek, a harbor of refuge safe from the stern law of civilized cities. Today this institution exists, and still carries on its varied work of extreme humanity. The low-roofed den, the old bench surrounded by the swarthy unshaved faces of the secretive crew, like bending shadows in tobacco smoke, breathing oaths as the cards are shuffled, has disappeared. But still the game is carried on, though in more magnificent style, for as the cities rise, the aristocracy of crime fortifies itself, becoming more guarded and respectable in outward appearance. Be assured that I dip my pen in stern experience for that which I tell you. When you see these headlines in your daily paper, bank manager disappears, officials in the dock, mayor and vicar missing, be sure that the head of the charity organization of the South Seas has read the colonial cable in the Marquesa News or Apia Times, and has rubbed his hands with delighted expectation, and that his agents are watching at the warden gates of the high seaports of the tropic world. Forest lands, caves and mountain fastnesses and unknown isles of security are fast disappearing from the world as it becomes polite. Where the Bokai feast roared and reveled, and the Fijian war dancers in the moonlight of other years whirled, in bloodthirsty revelry, by the Rewa River, now rise the church spires. Where the ambushed tribe once watched from the jungle with gleaming eyes pass austere university men, clad in gowns, with Bibles in their hands, to lecture on Christianity to open-mouthed natives. So things have changed, and the heathenish creeds of the old days faded, and it is my wish to give you one glimpse of that which has been. It was my lot to stay in the organization I speak of. A mile off was a small native village, where Mabau, a Fijian maid who helped Bones, the organization overseer, to keep the rooms clean and tidy, lived. Bones was the descendant of one of those old Botany Bay convicts who, escaping in a boat, put to sea, and eventually drifting ashore in Fiji, made their homes there, and inculcated in the islanders' minds the first contempt for the white race, contempt which by an age of vigorous striving, missionaries have at last removed. Bones told me much of his convict ancestor, who had been transported from England for stealing a hammer, and so Bones was born in the South Seas. He had a firm open face, grey English eyes, and a Fijian mouth. He was a fairly well-educated man, and though he looked rough, at heart was kind. He kissed Mabo's pretty face as though she were his own child. In fact, Bones in every way struck me as being most suitable for his job of running a South Sea charity organization, which was run upon exactly opposite lines to the charity organizations of the Western Seas, where the officials have stony eyes and steel-trap mouths. As I have told you, Bones had neither. And as I sat by him and a strange bird in the cocoa tree sang to the sunset, I felt drawn to him, and told him more than I would tell most men. It was a beautiful night. Most of Bones's friends were away, some at work and some at sea on trading schooners. Bones played the banjo and I the fiddle, and after indulging in some European and native folk songs, he lit his pipe and I strolled off under the palms. It was on this night that I met Mabau again. Now Mabau was a Fijian maid of rare beauty. She had shining dark eyes and a thick mop of hair. The graceful curves of her bare brown body as she glided neath the sunlit palms made many Fijian youths gaze enviously upon her. The chief Kifa, her father, sat by his hut door. He had been one of the high chiefs of Thakumbo, the last of the Fijian kings. Kifa was a majestic-looking man. In spite of his thick lips, he had fine features, with earnest eyes, and was straight-figured as a ko. As he sat there, dressed in his native Sulu, he smiled as I spoke to his daughter I knew more of her doings than he thought. She was a true daughter of Eve, for her glance gave no hint whatever that we had met before. For in my forest wanderings, about 2 days before the evening I have mentioned, I had met Mabao. She did not know at first that I had perceived her in a lonely spot. She knelt on her knees before a rotting cast-off wooden idol. Sunset had fired with red and gold the tops of the cocoa palms and forest trees. Overhead a few birds were still whistling. As I approached, and the dead scrub cracked beneath my feet, the heathen-hearted little maid looked hastily over her bare shoulder, and, seeing me, arose swiftly, as though for flight. My voice must have had a note in it that appealed to and reassured the guilty forest child, for I called softly and then smiled to let her know that from me no harm should befall her. "Why do you pray to that wooden thing?" I said, and then I gave the monstrous effigy a kick. With a frightened sigh, she looked up at me and said, "Oh, Papalangi, I love Vituo, the half-caste." Then with a blush, she told me all, and it seemed that the soul of innocence peered through her eyes, and asked for mercy, as she looked down at herself and then up to me again, one hand resting on her brown breast. I gazed silently and knew all. The perfidious Vituo had stolen her heart. "Me, Kili Vituo, your white god no help me, will he?" she said. I gazed a while and said, "Yes, he will, Mabao." I would not have told this thundering lie, but for the fact that her appealing eyes awoke the best that was in me, and it was my earnest wish to attempt to stay her from inflicting any vengeance on her sinful lover which might bring sorrow to her afterwards. Encouraged by my kindness, and misunderstanding my gestures, as I endeavored to explain that she should pray to the Christian God instead of to the gods of her fathers, she suddenly lifted her arms and started to chant into the wooden ears of the old idol again. On her knees she went, swaying her body and arms gently, all the while in the mystic Mabit charms. She sang on earnestly, and I gazed, astonished to see the heathen age before my eyes and to feel my eardrums vibrating to the primeval lore of the South Seas. Through the forest boughs just overhead crept the lingering rays of the dying sunset, and 2 golden streaks fell slantwise over the praying maid's brown body, glimmering in her thick dark hair as her head moved to and fro while she chanted her despair. "Mabo," I said, "where does Vituo live? Why not go and find him? Tell him of your love and offer your forgiveness. He will doubtless take you to his arms." In truth, I felt this might be, for she was a comely and pretty maid. At my saying this, she answered in this wise, "O white mans, I long die and go to Nedenji, or Mabranto the great goddess, who love deceived maids and make gods of children." Then, with a fierce look on her dark face, and with heaving bosom, she continued, "Mabranto will blow the breath of the big wind that will kill him, the wicked Vituo, and then him once dead will love me again, for good is his soul, though his body is whitish and wicked." I saw the depth of her love flame in her eyes, and I answered, "Mabao, go home, and I will pray to the white god for you, and we'll see what can be done to bring this treacherous Vituo back to you again." At this, with delight, she rose to her feet, her eyes and face shining and expressing pleasure at my promise. Her Sulu cloth of woven coconut fiber revealed her trembling thighs as, with the impulsiveness of the Fijian temperament, she started to sing and do the equivalent of a As I stood there, and the shadows of night thickened, I heard a voice, and Mr. Bones suddenly stepped from a clump of tall fern growth into the clearing where we stood. "What's up?" he said, and I knew then that he had been watching the whole performance. Mabao, who knew him well, started off, with feminine vivacity, to tell him all her trouble. He knew her language, and so she was able swiftly to tell her tale. Now Bones, as I have said before, was a decent fellow, and he listened attentively all the while that she spoke. Then he turned towards me and said, "Vituo is a treacherous skunk, and if he plays her false, I will see to it that he gets his deserts. Go home, Mabao, for old Kifa will be suspicious of your being out this late hour." Off she went, and I had not seen her again till this meeting by her parent Kifa's home. When I digressed to tell you that, notwithstanding her greeting me as though I were a stranger, nevertheless all that I have told you had happened between us. The chief, as I said, gave me a friendly greeting. I had seen him once before, when he had called at Bones's homestead and borrowed a mugful of rum. He was a genuine survival of the old cannibalistic days, though he had embraced Christianity as best calculated to serve his interests and requirements. For the Protestant and Roman Catholic ecclesiastics were very kind to him. He had embraced both the creeds. He still, deep in his heart, clung tenaciously to old memories and the heathen mythologies of his tribal ancestors. By his side sat Mabao, busily weaving a new fringed Sulu gown, with varied patterns decorating its scantiness, for it was the Fiji fashion to reveal as much as possible of the maid without her being accused of being absolutely nude. His only surviving wife was a full-blooded Fijian, and as I sat by his side, she squatted on her haunches, busily blowing, with her thick-lipped mouth, the embers of a tiny fire that flickered into 1,000 stars, to be scattered by her breath as the evening meal spluttered. Chief Kifa could speak excellent English, and as I stayed on, and the hour became late, he told me many things of the old days, of dark beliefs, and also of the mighty cannibalistic warrior, Vagabond. As he spoke, and the moon rose and lit the forest, his eyes brightened as the old splendor thrilled him. And Mabao, who sat by us alone, for the old wife had gone to bed in the hut nearby, rested her chin on her hand and looked up with sparkling eyes, listening eagerly, and I saw who encouraged her and why she had prayed so earnestly to the old forest idol. "Oh, white mans," he said, lifting his dusky arms as he spoke. "The old gods watch me tonight, and when I pass into Shadowland I shall be great chief, for am I not still faithful to them? Do I not cling to those who watched over my birth and gave me life?" As he spoke, a strange bird screamed afar off in the forest palms, and with his dark finger to his lips, he said, "Banaka, the dead speak, and they who were unfaithful to men and maids are being punished by the gods." For ere he finished, many screams came to our ears, as a flock of migrating wings flapped under the moon that was right overhead. Mabao, who had heard this, clapped her hands with delight, and I knew then that she had but little faith in Vichuo's promises. For I understood from Bones that he had seen and he had pledged his faithfulness to poor Mabao. I say poor Mabao because this is no romance that I tell you of, but simply an incident in the sad drama of life that came about through Vichuo's unfaithfulness. Much that Chief Kifa told me that night, and on following nights that I spent in his interesting company, still lives vividly in my memory, and I think it will be interesting to tell here some things I heard concerning the monstrous deeds of Thakumbo, ere the awful royal cannibal embraced Christianity. It appeared that Thakumbo had 6 Fijian maids, who were kept in the royal huts, sheltered and closely guarded by his high chiefs, and though the missionaries had landed in the Fijian group, and had even made homes on the isle, he managed to keep all that which the old chief told me a close secret. For some time, these 6 maids formed his harem, and they were proud of the royal favor. In time 2 of them became mothers, and when the babies were 6 months old, the high chiefs came in the dead of night and took them away. As time wore on, and Thakumbo sickened of the secret tribal harem, the mothers disappeared one by one, also only a scream disturbed the forest silence. Then the bukai ovens, wherein the dead were roasted, were made hot, and great were the rejoicings of the cannibalistic natives and the tribal grandees, who were favored by being admitted and presented at the court functions. At last of the 6 erstwhile maids 2 only were left, and one night they too disappeared and ceased to weep, and the harem huts were silent. Nedenji, the great Fiji god, blessed all those who had joined in the grand festival whereat the maids had been sacrificed, and as the assembled tribe sat in the terrible forest arena, drinking kava and gorging the dead, the Mabit spirits could be heard running, as their shadow feet sped across the midnight moonlit forest that surrounded the bokai ovens, and the cannibals looked affrighted over their shoulders as they heard the wailing cries of the souls of the dead mothers and maids, whom they were eating, being pursued by the souls of dead warriors and lustful old gods, who hungered after the shadows of beautiful dead women. "How terrible!" I suddenly gasped, being unable to control my utterance as the old chief told me these things. Quickly he looked up at me, and swiftly I recognized my mistake. for he was very proud of his dead king and all the horror I have told you. Continuing, I said, the Kumba was a great warrior, and the mighty Nedenji approved of his doings, and sanctioned them, as the white god does ours. Though I said that, the old fellow seemed to understand my feelings, and looking at me half kindly and half fiercely, said Nedenji did not sacrifice his own son, nor does he send the helpless, blind souls of his children to the Bokai ovens of hellfires to burn in agony for eternity. Nor did he hide in the dark of ages. Why did your mighty one God not come before? Why did he send you cursed whites to our isles to shout lies, ravish our maids and steal our lands? Wow, wow. Why smash our idols? Show me this great white God. Where is this thing you prayed about? Where? Saying this, he lifted his eyes to the skies, and so vehemently did he rattle on, and so many things did he say that smacked of the truth, that for a moment I hung my head and felt as though I were the heathen, and he the Christian. Bidding the fierce old fellow good night, I went swiftly across the flats, crept into the home of the fallen, by Rewa River, and slept. It was the next day that I met the treacherous Bones introduced me to him, and as I nodded, my friend gave me a wink, and so I assumed more politeness. I was much surprised by Vichua's appearance, for though he was a half-caste, his complexion was almost European. Certainly he was of a type which would appear handsome to Fijian womankind. And from his manner I saw at a glance that he was a mixture of the swashbuckler and cavalier. I pitied little Mabao exceedingly, for she would, night after night, come over to see us. And I knew that she came full of hope that she might meet Vichu, who often came down the Rewa to help the traders, and to take up cargoes of copra and many other things that grew on the plantations, which were cultivated and toiled over by the natives. I stayed with Bones for some days. He was extremely kind to me, and I was glad of the opportunity of getting a rest, and, moreover, the men who lived with him were strange characters and extremely interesting. Often, new arrivals came, some with heavy beards and some clean-shaven, ostensibly for the purpose of disguise. One old man, whose name was Enoch, was a quaint old chap and fondly loved rum. I do not know what he had done in his native land, which, I believe, was Australia, but at night he would shout in his sleep and suddenly awaking, sit up and gasp, and gaze with relief on the bunks around him, wherein slept the weary heads of the fallen. Now Enoch was very artful, for he found out that I was the rum keeper, and so it was my duty to share out. And night after night I was obliged to get out of my bed and give him tots of rum to allay the awful pain which a toothache was giving him. For several nights this kind of thing went on. I advised him at length to go to Shuva and get the offensive molar pulled out, but no, he would not hear of it. At last, after a wretched week of nights, disturbed by his groans and appeals for rum, I happened to tell him a joke, and as he opened his mouth wide with laughter, I saw to my disgust that he was toothless. Often I went out into the forest and, placing my music in the fork of a tree, stood and practiced my violin. The native children would hear, and come peeping through the tall fern and grass to listen. They became my little friends. I taught them to dance around me, and they screamed with delight. Several times Mabao came to see us, but Vichuo did not keep his promises. She would stand at the organization door for hours, watching the sunset fade over the hills, and then, with staring eyes, look down the long white track, where once he had so eagerly come singing, to fall into her arms. Bones and I, and even old Enoch, would strive to cheer her up. I used to play the violin and get her to sing with her soft, plaintive voice some of the low two hymns, and so in this way divert her mind from thinking of her faithless lover. For, to tell the truth, Vichuo was now only interested in a white woman who was staying at Chuva. Bones knew of this, and told me all about it, and so we all felt deeply sorry for him. In my heart I hated the treacherous half-caste for his heartless behavior. Time was going on, and Mabo's open disgrace, fast approaching, and, as Bones said, it would not be well for her, or Vichuo either, when the truth was out. The old chief, her father, still had a huge war club which was the equivalent of Fijian law, and there was no telling what might happen when her condition was no longer a secret. Poor Mabao. I still remember her melancholy as I made her sing while I played the low notes on the violin. for she could follow easily the chords on the G-string. But as the bow traveled up the scale to the higher notes, her ear seemed to fail her. It was interesting to listen to her wild voice, which so easily sang melodies in the minor key. Though as soon as I played in the major key, her voice seemed to grip hold of the notes and slowly drift the strain from the major to the minor. One night we were suddenly surprised by one of our companions appearing at the organization door with 2 new members. They were dark-looking men. One was extremely handsome and very polite, indeed almost courtly in his salutations, as he gently brushed the mug's rim and swallowed the proffered rum. Enoch, Mabau and I, sitting on our tubs, watched them intently as they stood side by side and spoke in broken English to Bones, who seemed quite satisfied with their credentials. For they were escaped convicts from New Mexico. They were unshaved and very disreputable looking, but after a wash, shave and brush up were considerably changed for the better, and I discovered that they were as gentle and intelligent as they looked. Riviere, the younger, that was not his real name, had, in a fit of jealousy, shot a rival in Paris, and so had been transported to New Caledonia, the French penal settlement, from where convicts often escaped to live exiled lives in the islands or Australian cities. Riviere fell in love with Mabau. He and I became very good friends, and though I told him of Vituo and all the trouble, still he gazed upon Mabau as she softly sang with eyes that seemed never to tire of gazing in her direction. Riviere had been exiled in a convict prison for over 5 years, and Mabau being the first woman whom he had spoken to since he escaped from incarceration. His infatuation for the Fijian maid was not so surprising as it would have been under normal circumstances. Alas, though Mabau approved of his tenderness to her, and seemed somewhat flattered at his admiring gaze, she did not encourage him, for notwithstanding the undress costume of the islanders and the looseness of the sexes in the native villages, Fijian maids were as modest as, and if anything more faithful to their lovers than the maids of civilized lands sometimes are. For 2 nights Mabau disappeared, and Bones being away on a trading trip, Riviere and I left the organization officials playing dominoes and drinking rum and went off south of the Rewa River, exploring, for we had heard that the natives were having high sprees inland, and that the Meek festival dances were in full swing. It was nearly dusk as we wandered along by the tropical palms and fern that grew thickly by the tiny track which we followed. Going across a pineapple plantation, we once more got onto the native road, and before the stars in heaven were at their brightest, we emerged from the thick bush growth and entered a clearing that extended to the native village homesteads that stood under the palms and banyans across the flat. It was a wonderful sight that appeared before us, for the old chieftains, and native women also, were dressed in war costume, their bodies swathed in bandages of grass and flowers. And as they danced wildly, they made the scene impressively weird. The general musical effect sounded like a Wagnerian orchestra being played out of tempo and tune. But the legendary atmosphere was perfect. It also possessed the barbarian note of Wagnerian music, which so wonderfully expresses the German nature, and shows that Wagner was a genius for true expression and anticipation. The moon came up and intensified the barbaric atmosphere that pervaded the excited village. From the hut doors peeped the tiny dark faces of the native children, who applauded with vigor the escapades of their old grandmother or grandfather, who, back once again in the revived memories of heathen days, threw their skinny legs skyward and did many grotesque movements that seemed impossible to old age and the stern decorum which those little children had erstwhile been used to from their august parents. Round the space, to the primitive music of thumped wooden drums lays, and the hooting of bamboo reeds, they whirled, and then suddenly the vigorous antics would cease and all would start walking round in a circle, as the maids, almost nude, except for a blossom or a little grass tied about them, joined in, opened their thick-lipped mouths in unison, and chanted some old strain that smacked more of heathenism than of the Christianity which most of them were supposed to have embraced. Under the cocoa palms hard by sat several old women who dealt in South Sea witchcraft. I never saw such pathetically hideous old hags as they were, their faces wrinkled up to a breathing map of sin and vice, as they put their fingers to their shriveled lips, and warned the innocent girls of sorrows to come, foretelling dire disaster, or the reverse, to those who appealed to them for prophecies. Many of the maidens from the surrounding villages came running up the bush track and delightedly joined in the circling ring of dancers. A few of the latter, who belonged to the low-caste toiling natives, availed themselves of the opportunity to show their figures off, and though the majority of the dancers were innocent enough, in their way, these looser ones swayed about and went through preposterous antics, endeavoring to please the eyes of the semi-savage native men who squatted round as sightseers. Great was their applause at frequent intervals, and deep the pleasure of those women who eagerly sought to please the eyes of prospective husbands. Revere and I stood watching this scene. Neither of us spoke, so deeply were we interested in all about us. Then I touched Revere and told him to look behind him. There sat Mabao at the feet of a villainous-looking old witch, who, responding to her pleadings, was doubtless telling Mabao how to win back Vichuo's love. There she sat, that artless, deceived maid, rubbing together the magic sticks, and repeating word for word all that the old witch told her. It sounded in this wise: "Oh wow, wee wow, why, oh mio, me," and so on, over and over again. Poor little Mabao, how fast she rubbed the magic sticks as unperceived. Riviere and I watched her from the shadows, and the old crone picked her 2 black front teeth with a bone skewer and thought over some new phrase for Mabao and the other maids to repeat after her. Many maids appealed to her and rubbed the sticks, some crossways and some ways, as they thought of the bonny promised babies that would be theirs, to ugly old divorced wives, who had been foretold new husbands and children if they rubbed the magic sticks the right way. Rubbed and rubbed so hard that their dark bodies were steaming with perspiration in the moonlight. Neither of us approached Mabao as we watched. We saw why she had been absent from us for 2 nights. We had no doubt that each night she had sat at the black crone's feet, listening to her prophecies and doing all she told her to do with those bits of stick, while Vichuo away in Suv made love to the young white woman and thought no more of Mabao, who was to bring down vengeance on his head for his sins. Next night Mabao watched at the trysting place for the old witch's prophecies to be fulfilled, but found that Vichuo did not come, as had been foretold. So, as she knew of an old and lonely missionary who lived some 8 miles from the spot where Riviere and I witnessed the native fate, she told us that she would go and visit the good white man and see if he could help her in her sorrow. Finding out from Bones where the recluse lived, I, being deeply interested, went off the following afternoon to see him. After 4 hours hard walking, I inquired from some natives, and following a track which was thickly covered with thongi and drala growth, arrived at Nar, which was situated southeast of the Rewa River and not far from the seashore. There, in a secluded spot close by a stream, was a small, neatly thatched homestead. As I approached, all seemed silent, deserted, and overgrown. The trees that shaded the hut-like home were heavy with thick, human hand-shaped leaves, which intensified the gloom and isolation. I coughed purposely. The door opened, and there, framed in the doorway, stood a tall, stooping, gray-bearded man of about 70 or 75 years of age. "Welcome, my son," he said as I introduced myself, and he noticed that I was tired, for the heat of the sun had been terrific, and I was parched with thirst. I had brought my violin with me for companionship and safety, though I had great faith in the organization officials. I did not wish to tempt their integrity by leaving my instrument behind. I sat and gazed round that little lonely homestead by the shoreside at Naran. The scent of the jungle blooms and dead grass crept into my nostrils as soft winds came up from the sea, blew in at the small doorway, and fell asleep in the leafy hollows. Opposite the doorway, by his broken-colored glass window, sat the missionary to whom Mabao had appealed. He had already given her his advice. He was a venerable-looking old man, with earnest, sunken gray eyes. As his aged, bearded lips moved, and he spoke in a sensitive musical voice, I at once felt a liking for him, and I seemed to be back in the days of an age that had long since passed away. For this lonely old missionary was the sole survivor of the first white men who had exiled themselves from their native lands, with the one intense motive only in their hearts to endeavor to preach the word of Christ and better the conditions of heathen lands. No ambition in his mind had craved for recognition. He had done his day's work, and there, weighed down with years, he waited sadly, yet patiently, the last act of life's drama. the call of his creator, to whose service he had devoted his earnest existence. He died, quite unknown to men on earth, for if men do not strive for fame, it seldom will come to them, unless they do not deserve it. "My son, what brings you this way?" he said, and his gray eyes gazed kindly at me. "Father," I said respectfully, "I heard of you from Mabo, the native girl who sorrows over her faithless lover, and since hearing of you, it has been my wish to meet you, and here I am." Hearing my answer, the old man looked intently at me, and to my great pleasure, I saw that I had impressed him favorably. "Art thou hungry, lad?" he said. "No, not hungry, but I am exceedingly thirsty, father," I answered. And at that he at once brought out, from a little wooden cupboard by his side, a coconut, and with trembling fingers pierced the holes with a screw. Very thankful I was, as I drank off a tin pannikin full to the brim of the refreshing fruit milk. After that I felt much refreshed and more at my ease, as I talked to my host. At his bidding, I took my violin from its case, and played the Ache la Morte from Il Trovatore to him. As the strain died away, and silently I laid the fiddle down, he crossed his hands over his breast and sat in the gloom, for night was falling fast. He looked like an old gray-bearded apostle carved in stone as he sat there. "My son, thou playest well, and I am thankful for thy visit," he murmured. And I was touched and highly pleased, for deep in my heart I suddenly felt a tenderness for the lonely old missionary. I saw by the way he crossed his hands that he was a Roman Catholic. I am a Protestant by birthright, but his sincerity made me feel more attached to his denomination than my own. As night fell and the stars came out, he became more talkative and unburdened himself to me, a fact which I always remember with pride, for he would not have done so if he had not felt instinctively that my heart was in sympathy with his. Rising and lighting an old oil lamp, he stood it on the window shelf, and its faint flicker lit up his room. In the corner was a sleeping mat, for he slept on the floor in native fashion. His furniture consisted of 2 wooden stools, a small bench table, and a few cooking utensils. Outside the door in a cage was a large gray parrot. It looked as old as its master, was almost featherless, and seldom spoke. But now and again it would gaze sideways at me, and without opening its tuneless beak, say in a sepulchral voice, "Goodbye, goodbye," as though it were jealous of my conversation with its lonely master. It was a wise old bird, mistrusted strangers, and realized that old age could be tempted and led away from old friendships by the voice of youth. As we sat there together, the moon came out and shone brilliantly over the sea, outdoing the dimness of his oil lamp. So brightly did it shine over the palms that one could easily have read ordinary print. Taking an old flute down, he started to play upon it, and then with a sigh laid it back on the shelf and asked me if I should care to stay the night. "Yes," I immediately answered. We went out and strolled in the moonlight, and he told me much of Fiji in the old days. Though he was a poor and aged man, with only the moonlit forest flowers as his friends, flowers that would someday blossom over his fast dissolving dust, the largest of his sincere heart. All that he told me has been vast wealth to my memories through the years, and his dead voice has haunted my dreams at times. He too told me of Thakumbo. He had known him in his worst days, and spoke with the famous warrior king when he had at length, after many councils with his chiefs, decided to embrace Christianity. As we strolled under the straight-stemmed palms, the silvered moonlit waves splashed over the coral reefs below, and across the waters, like a weird shadow, passed a canoe filled with singing natives. "Who sleeps there?" I asked him as we passed a mound of earth, whereon was a cross half hidden in jalaweed. He told me that it was the grave of a white man who had left a ship at Viti Levu, and had become attached to the wife of a notable chief. The chief discovered them together by the shore, and after a terrible battle, the white man with the rifle butt, and the chief with a club, the white man fell mortally wounded. In the struggle, the native wife was shot dead, and her spirit, the natives say, was carried on wings of fire up through the trees towards the stars that light the shores of that heathen land, which was ruled by The missionary told me that he crept through the forest and with his own hands dug a grave under the pandanus palms for the slain body of the white man. And night after night, he came and prayed fervently over the man of his race, asking God to forgive and grant to his soul salvation. I was much impressed as he told me these things, and also by seeing how, as we walked along, he would tenderly bend and touch the tall flowers with his lips. Under them sleeps the child I loved, or the chief who fell in some bloody tribal fight, he would say, and he told me also that often in the Fijian wilds men, women and children were buried in spots known only to those who loved and buried them. That same night, as we walked along the narrow track by the shoreside at Narandro, the aged missionary took me gently by the arm, and turning up the inland track, we stood by a native's conical-shaped hut. In it sat an old, almost blind chief, the half-brother of Vagabond, a great warrior who was dead. It appeared that he loved the missionary, and though he would not give up his heathen faith had, owing to the supplications of my host, half embraced Christianity. It was the habit of the father to call night after night and pray with the old heathen chief before he slept. I felt very strange as I stood watching the white man and the old Fijian kneeling side by side praying, while 3 old women squatting in the corner of the den gazed on silently. As though they were carved stone images, they were his servants. Being of Fijian royal blood, he would not move himself. Often as he sat there, he imperiously pointed to a stone flask wherein was some chikona. 16, and at once the slaves of royalty, with machine-like swiftness, filled a stone bowl and held it to his lips. Suddenly starting up, he rushed to the den door and gazed up at the trees, shouting, why, taho me, then waved his arms, lifted his chin towards the stars, and called to the memory of dead warriors and comrades dead with heathen gods. As the Pacific wind sighed softly through the giant baka trees, he bowed his head reverently, for to him so answered the gods. I stayed that night with the missionary, and the next day and night also, and heard many strange things. Beautiful were some of the legends of the forest children that my host told me. The stars were the eyes of the fiercer gods, and the falling stars the bright tears of the powerful Muberto and Nedinji's warriors. Fijian maidens and youths prayed to the eyes of Shadowland, and if, as their impassioned lips met, a star fell and arched over them in the vault of night, great was their sorrow, for a god had shed a tear over the grief that would befall the life of the firstborn. But if, ere the lovers said farewell, more stars fell, great was their rejoicing, for it was a sign that other gods were pleading to the greater God to stay the evil that was predestined by the first star that burst out of the dark soul of evil destiny. So, notwithstanding heathenism and the gruesome cannibalistic customs of the old times, much innocence and poetry softened the hearts of the wild native children of those dim lands. It was a common sight by night in the shade of the cocoa palms to see lovesick maids in the arms of the Fijian youths, gazing at the skies, yearning for the sight of the vast gods shedding starry tears on their behalf. And often, great was their delight to find the foretold grief to their firstborn, overthrown by the power of other gods. Then the innocent maids gave themselves, body and soul, to the infatuated, delighted youths, and fell with the falling of the stars. When the stars on windy nights twinkled fiercely through the wailing boughs of the bending forest giants, lovers gazed heavenward anxiously, for to them the glimmering stars were the tiny bright legs of their unborn children running happily across the fields of paradise. Often, too, sorrowing mothers would peer up for hours on those windy, starlit nights, as they watched their dead children's bright legs twinkling as they ran, laughing over the forest trees in the Farah fields of Shah. As I heard these beliefs of the forest, I thought of Mabau, and wondered whether, while she was in the arms of Vijuo, the stars had fallen, and in her poetic faith she had given herself to him. And I saw that though the native legends were beautiful, it was sad for the maids, for the stars foretold many things that did not come to pass, and mythology, when applied to morals, brought much sorrow to those that loved. The aged missionary spoke the language like a native, and so, through mixing with the remnants of his old flock for years, isolated as he was, knew all their ways and their passions and aspirations. He told me that the mythology and religions of the South Seas revealed, through their poetic, heathen expression, much that was new thought in modern Europe, and that all those things which the great minds of my country had discussed and the nobleness they had overthrown by their doctrine of the survival of the fittest, a doctrine bringing the whole creed of self-sacrifice and bravery down to selfish motives, had been discussed and expressed in mythology and heathen song by the cannibalistic bards and philosophical savages at the Bokai feasts of those heathen lands where maidens gave their lives for their lovers, and wives for their husbands, for it had been the custom that when a chief died, his wife should be buried alive with him. And so strong was the faith of these people that they met their terrible end bravely, and sang death songs, which could be heard faint and muffled as the tombstone closed over them. It was even then the custom of maids to die and be buried with their dead lovers, their belief being that they appeared before the gods as they died. Those who thought themselves young and beautiful sacrificed themselves, so that in spirit land they might be ever young and fortunate in their love affairs. Often I saw skeletons in caves, which were the remains of old age. They had been strangled by their relatives to avoid further trouble from the complainings of their infirmities. On the night preceding my last day with the old missionary Mabao, the native girl came to him as sunset was fading over the seas. As the shadows crept and thickened around the hermit's home, a noise of naked feet in the jungle grass disturbed us. A gentle tap at the door revealed Mabao's dusky face. I understood little that she said, for she spoke in her own language to my host. But I saw by her eyes and trembling lips that she was sorely troubled. After hearing the father's advice, she became calmer, and falling on her knees, kissed his extended hand and bearded face as a child would kiss its father. Then, without speaking a word, she ran off swiftly into the forest. The old missionary asked me many questions as to where I was staying, upon which I told him of Mr. Bones. Hearing this, he gravely shook his head and scanned me solemnly. "You look an honest lad and well able to take care of yourself," he said. And then I explained to him how I had left my ship at S because I could not stand a drunken crew. And that was the true reason for my accepting the organization's hospitality. From him, I heard that a week or so before I arrived a fugitive had appeared at the organization, and the second day after had shot himself. Bones had hastily called on the father, who delivered the sacrament to the dying man, who ere his breath ceased, made his confession. The father did not reveal the facts to me, but I heard them from the lips of a high-caste Fijian, with whom I stayed between my visits to the organization's shanty. For after the first few days I only called upon Mr. Bones as a visitor, taken there through my adventurous spirit, and for the novelty of associating with old villains, and seeing the sad fugitives who arrive from the far-off cities of the world. That night, as I lay by my hermit host, I watched him as he quietly slept on his sleeping mat. Moonlight streamed through the tiny window hole and revealed his careworn bearded face. Still as death he lay as the breeze crept into the open door and stirred the few gray hairs above his lofty brow. The beating of the seas on the shore sounded at intervals and died away. The shadow leaves of the palms outside moved gently over the wooden moonlit walls. Over his gray-bearded face and crossed hands, I felt that I was back in the Middle Ages, in some mysterious medieval monastery, instead of in that heathen land of dying crime and bloodthirsty cannibalism, where but a few years before the warrior king, who now lay in the grave not far off at Bo, sailed forth from the creeks below to give battle to rival kings, accompanied by his armada of outrigged canoes. As I dreamed I heard the restless seas below, I saw those primitive fleets of canoes fading in the sunset, filled with dark, savage, patriotic faces, and the stalwart cannibal king, leaning on his war club, and gazing proudly as he stood eyeing the canoes of his warriors, paddling along to meet the tribal foe. It was almost unbelievable how swiftly change, through the coming of the white men, had overthrown the cannibalistic festivals and heathen customs at Lavu. Vaiti Lavu and Suva church spires were rising, where the Bokai feast and fierce songs once broke the silence. From native homes now come the strumming of cheap German pianos and Lotu songs sung by mouths that a few years before had eaten those they had loved. At daybreak, Father Anster, the old missionary, rose and prepared breakfast, after which he took his flute from the shelf and played one tune over and over again continually. And the old featherless parrot in the cage tried desperately to repeat the notes through its tuneless beak, and to tell the truth, made as much mess of the melody as my host did, for though he had music in his soul, his lips were unable to express it. There he sat, holding the flute to his aged lips and blowing away, and though I know he must now be dead, hallowed dust somewhere near that spot where I saw him years ago. Still, I can see him sitting by his little doorway, and see the kind look in his eyes as I bade him farewell and passed away into the forest, with the thought and promise to see him again in a few days. As I strolled along under the palms and big tropical trees, I fell into deep thought. Everything was silent, except a few birds singing to the sunset, which they could spy from the topmost boughs whereon they sat. Suddenly I was startled by hearing a noise, and crossing the gullies, I went down a steep slope and peeped through the jungle thickets of bamboo beneath the cocoa palms to see what was about. And there, romping in the deep fern grass, was a flock of naked native children, tiny wild faces, boys and girls. As I watched, my foot slipped. In a moment they all looked up, and their bright eyes spied me. Like a drove of rabbits off they bolted, their little brown shoulders and tossing heads of frizzly hair just reaching the fern tops, as they raced away and faded in the distant forest gloom, frightened out of their lives. A stream of sunset out seaward crept through the wind-blown forest boughs and glinted over them as they ran, till they looked like tiny wood elves racing across fairyland. I never saw such a pretty sight. In fun I ran after them, and two little stragglers left behind, seeing me run, screamed. Then through the bushes in front of me suddenly poked the heads of mop-haired mothers and fierce dark men. I had come across a native village. At first I felt a bit frightened, but as soon as those wild-blooded parents saw my white face and youthful look, they smiled, for their instincts are swift and true. I stepped into the village, and soon we were all good comrades. It was there that I met a missionary who lived not far off, and was advisor and preacher to the native village. He was a good man at heart, but extremely bigoted, and when I asked him about Father Anster, he yawned and evaded my questions, told me that he was considered a mild kind of lunatic. I did not argue the point, but nevertheless, I saw the way the wind blew, and thought a good deal. I realized there was no love lost between my old host and the new missionaries, who did not care for hermits, who toiled and lived completely by themselves. The hot season was at its height, and not till the sun had set and the sea winds gently blew over the isle did I feel comfortable. One is forcibly reminded when traveling in the South Sea Isles that the natives in complete undress are utilizing their own skins to the best advantage. Often I envied them their scanty Sulu loincloth, as my white duck trousers and shirt flopped and steamed with perspiration as I sweated onwards. I stayed for several hours at the village I had stumbled across. Round the native huts, the evening fires blazed as, squatting by stone bowls, the families ate their supper, dipping their fingers into the steaming mixture. They pushed worm-like stuff into their dark mouths. The toothless old chiefs and mothers were waited on by the children, who often sulkily helped them, hastily pushing what looked like long white worms that hung from the aged mouths. In between the mumbling lips, close by, in one of the conical thatched dens, loudly wailed a windy harmonium, played by a young aspirant for musical fame. The selling of harmoniums in the South Seas in those days was a paying business. A native would work for 3 years on a plantation, without wages, to possess one of those instruments of torture, and a family that possessed one obtained a social distinction equal to the Order of the Bath in Great Britain. It was the celebrated High Chief Volca who owned this particular terrible thing. While the huddled natives chattered and gorged over their calabashes of hot mystery, this chief led me round and proudly showed me the sights. Sunset had died, and the stars were beginning to peep through the dusky velvet blue skies that could be seen in many patches above the scattered waveless palms and banyan trees. Chief Volca was a true survival of the barbaric age, 6 feet in height, scarred and tattooed from his brow to his knees. He had lost one eye in battle, and the other, through double use, bulged considerably. Leading me into his ancestral hall's 3 thatched rooms, he stood beside me, as his mop head touched the low roof, and pointed to a ponderous war club that hung on the wooden wall. Round it was a grim collection of spear-headed weapons. Standing by my side, with his shoulders majestically lifted and his chest blown out, he proudly told me of the wounds that implement had inflicted, and of the many lives it had, with sudden force, sent hastily to heath. His one eye flashed with revived memories, and then that old veteran of some past, Fijian Waterloo told me how his civilized tribe had exterminated the uncivilized foe in a mighty battle, and of the benefit the great victory had conferred upon humanity. For did not the victory overthrow tribal men who ate their wounded on holy days, thus angering the gods by not keeping them in pickle till the Fijian Lent had passed? He stood there, drawn up to his full height, his shriveled but erstwhile muscular arm outstretched, as he told me of the overthrow of tribes on neighboring isles, who had aspired to dominate the whole Fijian group by militarism. With forgivable pride he took down the huge club that had brought the ambitious leader of the hated hordes to the earth, with a smashed skull. It was a mighty weapon, and the bare-skinned youth beside him gazed upon it with awestruck eyes, as I said, "And what happened after that victory? We had 10 years of great peace, many feasts and many wives, and our gods were pleased till came your race and overthrew them." And then he continued in this wise: "Alas, our great civilization has passed away. Revered customs, creeds and mighty histories of my race are forgotten with the old winds. Ah, your white race tramples on our old dynasty of supreme goodness." I gazed silently as he spoke, and wondered much, for I knew that the foundation of civilization, and all that is called best, is built on man's attempt to ward off impending disaster. As I thought, I wondered how much wisdom lay in his natural vanity, for the warriors of old had died out, and the new race looked cute, flabby, and quite devoid of energy. Outside, old men and youths smacked their lips and grunted as they nibbled coconuts and chewed tobacco. The grandees drank new rum, and the old women and maids of fashion whispered scandal and scratched their mop heads delicately with one outstretched finger. Brilliantly the moon shone through the forest trees as I strolled from scene to scene of that South Sea village. By tiny campfires sat the elder members of the various households. The little children were fast asleep by them on small mats. Some gazed into the fire ash, spat and chewed, others chatted, and on the hillside sat several groups singing softly so as not to awaken the sleepers. They were strange, weird melodies that I listened to, and as I stood alone in the shadows, I knew that I heard in those primeval wails of joy and sorrow the youthful voice of music and poetry as it was ere it attained the artificial development expressed in Europe, tricked out and dressed in all the artistries to suit applauding conventionality. Old women wailed songs that told of dead children, dead husbands or lovers, and all the many griefs that flesh is heir to. I think the sad old missionary with whom I had stayed had awakened in me a note of deeper thought than was usual in my reflection. On my memory are still vividly engraved the scenes of that night. The moonlight over the trees, the stars and the squatting groups of the village natives are all still mine, and the atmosphere is as clear as yet somewhat sadder than, of yore, like a melody heard again. After many years, in another country, I seemed to know that the wildlife and scenery around me was similar to the embryo life of modern civilization, and there was something real and innocent in that Fijian Arabian night that made the modern world of life look intensely vapid. I still see the women of Fijian fashion, with their legs outstretched before the dying fires, each attired in some sailor's cast-off undershirt or a portion of a white woman's garment. Some strutted under the palms and gazed almost disdainfully upon maidens and mothers who only wore the native grass-weaved sulu. I knew that I gazed upon the first leaders of Fijian fashionable society that has reached the zenith of vanity in Europe. I saw budding knighthoods, fanning flies and mosquitoes from the high chief's oily body. His eyelids blinked approval as the aspirants to royal favor lifted his fat feet, which rested on a little mat, and blew their cooling breath on them. Poor relations carried refuse in large stone bowls to the village cesspool. Pet mongrel dogs snapped at the hovering ring of flies and sniffed at the stench as they passed it, whilst the rich relations lolled under the sunlit tropic palms. At the far end of the village, on a stump, stood the fanatic, shouting in Fijian, "Tahoayo," and shrieking and stamping to entice the straggling villagers to come to his special mission class. Swarthy Solomon Islanders and Indians with brilliant dark eyes gazed at the maids. Under the palms sat the full-lipped youth Lodomeo, oblivious of all around him. He toiled on with his rusty nail, carving on a seashell the outlines of a maiden's face. The work revealed wonderful talent. Maidens and youths embraced and gazed with shining eyes at each other, as the shaky-headed Fijian poet pointed to the evening star imaged in the still lagoon. For it shone in the fairyland of still waters. They peered over the water's brink, and wondered to see their dark faces under the imaged trees that were upside down. Then the branches stirred as the mirrored winds blew in the water, and their imaged faces broke up and disappeared. I got the old chief to see me safely on the road home. For though I trusted the Fijians, I did not like the look of the imported Indians, who crept about the village selling sham jewelry and tempting the maids with trifles and trinkets. They were stealthy-looking men, dark and masterful in appearance. Their creeds were slowly overthrowing Christianity, for the natives were weak, and Mohammedanism was more in harmony with their secret cravings and requirements. Also, the color of the turban teachers matched their own skins. White men can hardly blame the childish Fijians for embracing Mohammedanism as readily as they turned to Christianity. For in London town, the Islamic creed is being preached, and is finding numerous adherents gathered from the so-called high-class Christians, who gain greater comfort from Muhammad than from the sorrow of Calvary. Grace hides in plain rooms. A cup of coconut water shared by a weary priest, a cracked flute under moonlight, a parrot muttering goodbye. These are not ornaments, they are the scaffolds of a soul that chooses service over applause. The islands remind us that dignity isn't the absence of hardship, but the presence of purpose. Faith, here, is less a sermon than a habit of showing up, listening long, and defending the small and the silent. If a story can make us gentler, it is already a victory. And now, please enjoy the next part of the story. Returned once more to the organization rooms, so tired that I fell asleep without delay, and not until next morning was I introduced to several members whom I had not seen before. My toothless friend was mumbling away to an old shovelback, who in turn was striving to outdo his comrades' experiences on land and sea. "Glad to see yer," said the old salt, as Bones introduced me. I returned the compliment and shook his extended hand warmly. He was the life of the place, and not pleasant life either, for he had an old cornet, and in the middle of the night would lift his face to the low roof, and blow some wretched tune on it over and over again. One night there was a fight, for as he played and sang and rolled his eyes to the ceiling, a boot struck him behind the ear. One of the members had lost his temper and thrown it. The incident caused a fearful hubbub. The cornet got smashed to bits, and one or two of the bunks broken down. Bones came in, pointed a revolver at the fighters, and threatened to shoot, and I believe he would have done so if they had not quieted down. They were a rough crew, and I made up my mind to get away from the place at the first opportunity. Many strange things I heard, some of which I will tell you. Next day, as I sat alone reflecting in the organization's gloomy room, I heard Mabau just outside wailing, a native chant of lovesickness. She had peeled the spuds and finished the domestic duties, for which Bones gave her ample wages. "What did the kind white missionary say, Mabau?" I whispered softly to her, as Bones and two scrubby-faced villains puffed their pipes and shuffled a pack of cards on the bench. Looking up with affectionate eyes that gazed at me steadily for a little time and then dropped. As she sighed, she answered, "He say pray to white God, go to your people. And if your vituo no love, you quickly find him who will love you." And as she said this to me, she gazed into my eyes in an appealing way that made me sorry for her. "Come this way, Mabau," I said, and she followed me like a little child, till out of earshot she sat under the cocoa palms behind the organization hut. I took her there because I wanted to be alone with her to advise her for her own sake. I liked Mabau exceedingly, for I saw in her something deeper than I had noticed in most native girls. Sitting by me in the jungle fern, with her chin on her knees, she lifted her eyes to me and sang a weird love chant. "Wail, oh woe mio," it sounded, as she sang tenderly her beseeching plaint. "Why do you sing, Mabau?" I asked. "Is it the wicked vituo that makes you so sad?" "Vituo I hate," she answered fiercely. "I will kill him, and the white man will be my friend." But I shook my head and told her not to kill vituo, but go to her own people, and as I spoke I pointed to the forest. Obediently as a child she rose, and before moving away gave me a shell comb from her hair. I accepted it and smiled kindly at her, for I felt sorry for the brown forlorn girl. Then with pattering bare feet she went down the forest track, wailing. I went back to the organization room and practiced my violin, as I always did, for several hours every day, both on land and sea. I think it was that same night that a portly gentleman looking like a bank manager came down the river from Suva and hastily entered the door, talking hurriedly to Mr. Bones. Opening a little bag, he gave him a bundle of what appeared to be banknotes, and so placed himself under the protection of the organization flag. He was fashionably dressed in a tall hat and frock coat, the tail of which had a singed hole in it, as though he had been shot at close quarters. Rubbing his hands genially, as though with great relief, he looked round the secluded room, and then asked me if I were English, and inquired if many of my countrymen resided in those parts. My reply allayed his anxiety on that point. He had a big, round, clean-shaven, red face. Gray locks protruded from beneath the rim of his tall hat, and fitted his brow and neck so nicely that it was easy to see that he wore a wig. His expression was like his hair, false. His was a face that could look jolly and lascivious, or sedate, at will, or even appear deeply thoughtful and religious should occasion require. Intensely preoccupied, he sat looking at newspaper cuttings, and with a vacant stare said as I spoke to him. The natives in the scenery round had no interest for him. Some life-and-death business had hastened him our way. He stopped only 2 nights and then left by the next Frisco steamer, bound for some port outside the reach of the extradition treaty. I was glad to see him go. Every time anyone opened the door, he started so that it got on my nerves. Once, when Bones suddenly opened the door with a crash, on purpose I believe, he gave a leap and lifted the lid of the emergency barrel, upsetting the mugs of rum and causing the whole organization to swear as one man. As he jumped in, I quickly put the lid on before he could lower his shoulders and head, and crash went his tall hat, while I heard a muffled oath beneath the lid. The emergency barrel was a huge ship's beef barrel, which stood behind the door, and in it new members of the organization hid when the overseas police arrived. A cave beneath the floor was a secret known to old members only. It was a mystery to me how these preoccupied fugitives from justice got to know of Bones's establishment. My mystification was dispelled by one of the old officials, who let me into the secret, telling me more than he should have done, as he swallowed rum and became loquacious. It appeared that Bones boarded the boats as they arrived at Chuva, Vanuatu, or Lacumba, interviewed passengers and spotted likely customers. With years of research and experience, he had developed a bloodhound's instinct for twigging uneasy fugitives, and by devious artifices, managed to give them the hint and let them know that he was the man who understood difficult positions, and was willing to be a faithful friend to all those who yearned to remain unknown. I also learned that Bones was not above the ruse of getting a confederate on board the boat, who would pose as a detective and suddenly turn round and scrutinize any suspicious passenger, and so deliberately frighten him into hurriedly leaving the ship. By a prearranged signal, when the native canoes brought the flying fugitive ashore, the organization officials arrested him. Those who confessed offhand were given the straight hint that their captors were not beyond accepting a bribe and letting the prisoner escape. If they had no money, Bones behaved well to them, put them up for a time, then shipped them off at the first chance. Those who had managed to bring wealth with them gave Bones a liberal bribe, and you can imagine it was no hard job to get it out of them. Men from all parts of the world sought the South Seas as a hiding place. Some came to save their necks, many to escape penal servitude. The charity organization of the South Seas was not far behind its namesakes in Europe. It was a paying concern, and though the method on which it was conducted was risky and strange, it was run on lines of truth and charity. Stolen money only was accepted. The guilty were punished by being robbed, and help was given to the fallen, who were taken in, fed, and finally guided on the road to seclusion and security. Assuredly, it did not reverse its creed, as the organizations of Western seas do, where bent old men on tottering feet tap at the door of charity and apologizing for being old, start to earn the crust of charity by lifting the pickaxe and breaking stones as hard as the hearts of the British officials who waddle, with fatness and the wealth screwed out of insane charity. I could tell many distressing details of that South Sea hospitality. Fiction pales into insignificance beside the realities, the tragic dramas of life that came to that old shanty. I could tell you how men fell through the lure of gold, and the temptation to appear wealthy and respectable, in the cities of a civilization that so often defeats its own purpose. For how often men fall in their ambition to gain the good opinion of those who only appear better than themselves. The unpractical passion of love also brought much wealth to the South Sea organization's I remember one middle-aged gentleman whose manner brought to that degraded forest homestead a flavor of English society. With him, in the tastefully laid-out little room, wept a girl, obviously brought up in English respectability. She was a pretty blue-eyed girl, but her face had aged with grief and remorse and the thought of motherhood. Mabao was her ever-tender maid and companion. The bond of sympathy that linked the brown and the white woman together expressed something that had an intense note of poetry in it. Mabao's wild intuition read the girl's sorrow and remorse. The two women, so far removed from each other by blood and education, through mutual grief and instinct became equal. Softly Mabao stroked her white sister's face, and she in turn caressed the brown girl, who also was fast approaching motherhood. I asked no questions of her male companion as he and I together strolled across the landscape. I led him to the native villages, and did my best to interest him and take him out of himself during the 3 days that he stayed with Bones. We conceived a mutual liking for each other, and he took me sufficiently into his confidence to let me know that they were on the way to South America. I saw them both off by the S.S. From Suva. Mabao carried the white girl's things to the boat. As they stood on the ship's deck, they waved their hands to us, and we stood watching the frail girl, clinging to the man's arm. As the vessel moved away and the tropical sunset flooded the seas, we stared till the ship was a speck on the waste of waters. So disappeared those outcasts on the horizon, together with their passion and its fruits, bound for another land, fading from our sight forever. Mabao cried bitterly. I felt very sad also as we went down the river, and the hut looked more lonely than ever to me after they left. I only stayed with Bones as a visitor, and several times went off to Lake Kumba and the various isles of the group, visiting Thombo and the Eastern Isles, also Kandavu and the native villages inland from Vanalavu, in the Bua district. Some of the natives owned profitable plantations, planted chiefly with cocoa palms for the produce of copra and food for domestic use. I often roamed those barbaric lands quite alone, and used to stand and reflect as I gazed through the wooded landscape. The solitude seemed so peaceful, but my dreams would conjure up pictures of the hot-footed, bloodthirsty tribes on the warpath long ago, swarthy bodies and mop heads moving through those glooms to charge the ambushed rival tribe, finally bringing their victims to the ovens that fizzled the long pig, where now the cattle roam at leisure, nibbling the kovatu grass and milk fern of the cleared pastures. Once towered thickly wooded forest slopes of tropic fern and cocoa palm. Patches of those forests still remain. In those old glooms, I roamed and spent many happy and exciting times, for among them still stood native villages of semi-savage peoples. Many of them clung to old heathen beliefs and sneered as they passed the den wherein moaned the wailing harmonium. Fierce fights often raged among the population, for they were a mixed party, many of them being emigrant islanders from the Gilbert, Ellice and Samoan groups. I used to wander about those old native villages, undecided whether to go to Australia or to get a berth on one of the trading boats bound for Honolulu, and so make my way to San Francisco. The weather was very hot, the thermometer reaching 95. As I sat in the shade beneath the trees, above my head chuckled peculiar migratory birds, pruning their wings and whistling to the infinite blue above their topmost bough, which swayed gently to the welcome sea breeze that blew inland. It was there that I saw a native funeral. A Fijian girl had died. I watched the thatched den's door open, as swarthy men, with bowed, lamenting heads, bore on their shoulders the square-shaped coffin. It was sunset and the burying. The whole village started wailing, beating their breasts and naked thighs as they moved on in the grotesque but sad procession. One old woman, the great-grandmother I think, led the way to the native cemetery. It was a mournful sight, and a novel one for Western eyes, for their grief seemed real. By a lonely forest track the procession stopped, and there, in the shade of a mighty group of banyan trees, was the grave. Loudly the mourners started to wail, and the old woman and the girls fell flat on their faces, and groveled on the forest turf, wailing a Fijian lament, while the male mourners drank kava from little pots to keep their spirits up. To my astonishment, the old woman was lowered into the grave first. She stretched her body out, feigning death so well that her naked limbs and corpulent brown frame looked stiff with rigor mortis. For powerful chiefs, two at her head and two at the middle, slowly lowered her into the tomb. Then came forward one who I presumed was the high priest, and, standing on the brink of the grave, he lifted his hands towards the skies, and called on the gods to take the living spirit of the old woman into the land of death, to look after the soul of the dead girl. As the high priest yawned and finished his speech, he walked away, and maidens cast flowers onto the living body below. For a moment I thought that the old woman was to be buried alive, but to my relief I saw her dark skinny fingers hastily emerge and cling to the grave's brink, as up came her head and she leaped out on all. Then the lid of the coffin, wherein lay the dead girl, was lifted, and the mourners each in turn gazed upon the face and wailed. I did not look, for the sight depressed me, and I hurried away. This method of burial, and the ceremony which I have described, was an old custom modified, a method employed by a new sect, a creed which was based half on heathenism and half on Christianity, similar to the many crank offspring creeds of Europe today. After staying in Suva for 2 or 3 days, idling and boarding the few trading schooners in the harbor, I went back to the den of mystery presided over by Mr. Bones. As I entered the organization door, I saw, through the wreaths of tobacco smoke, the villainous, unshaved profiles of the gay officials, as bending over the long bench, they shuffled cards, swore and drank rum. As they welcomed me, their fierce, suspicious, wrinkled brows smoothed out again. I had left my violin with them, and, though I had been absent several days, it stood on the shelf over their heads as I had left it. They called on me for a solo as I sat down and smoked, but when I responded to their wish, a terrible discord began, for the player of the smashed cornet joined in and put my ear out. His time and tune faculties were nil. When I stopped, he still blew on, puffing out tune. As the night advanced, yarns began, and I heard experiences of those rough men, and truly truth is stranger than fiction. Much that I heard is unprintable, not so much because of its subject and expressive thought, as from the fact that in Bones's hospitable establishment I received trust that once betrayed would bring dire disaster on fugitives who are still hiding, or have relatives of high standing in England and elsewhere. Among others, there was one weird-faced fellow there at that time. He looked thin and ill, but had been handsome in his day, and often through his rough accent came a different utterance, that of an educated man. Over his bunk were the photographs of a girl and of 2 old people. Something in his life had played havoc with him, for secret grief had prematurely wrinkled his brow and face. His eyes were clear, blue and earnest. All the men took to him, for he was willing enough, and when they chaffed him, he smiled good-naturedly and revealed the expression that had lit his face up as a boy. Bones had picked him up adrift at sea whilst he was on a trip to Tonga in a schooner. The man had stowed away on a boat at Sydney that was bound for South America. The detectives had got wind of his being aboard. He had hidden himself between decks among the mast cargo, bales of wool. After the second day at sea, the detectives who were aboard came down into the hold to see if they could discover his whereabouts. Without water, and with only a few biscuits to nibble at in his huddled confinement, he suffered agonies. It was almost stifling up on deck under the tropical sun, but down deep in the ship's hold he was almost suffocated, and the droves of hungry ship rats smelt his sweating body and viciously attacked him in the inky darkness. Often I had half a mind to give myself up, said he, for the cursed vermin bit at my legs as I beat with my hands to keep them from eating at my face. I dared not sleep. Indeed, as I dozed off once or twice, I felt them pushing along under the legs of my trousers, and their rough tongues, like tiny saws, licked at the beads of cold sweat that broke out all over me. As he continued, the game of cards along the bench ceased. All hands became still with interest. Mabau, who crouched near my feet, gave a deepening blush as I gazed at her squatting on the floor beside me. She was gazing at Vittuo's photograph, which he had taken in soup. Proceeding with his story, as we puffed our pipes silently, he continued. Suddenly I heard a creaking noise forward. The bulkhead doors were opening. Peeping between the bales of cargo, I saw the flash of a bullseye lantern. They were crawling over the cargo searching for me. The human bloodhounds nearly trod on my body as they flashed their lanterns over the gloom and crept past me in the dark. In a second I saw my chance. I noiselessly worked my body backwards as they were searching the cargo right ahead. Half dead, I got through the bulkhead door and stood on deck. It was night. The stars lit the skies overhead and the funnel belched out reddened smoke that rolled astern. She was cutting across the Pacific at 14 knots. How I drank in the fresh air as I crept up by the still-cold grating. Hiding myself by the funnel, I gazed up. There was the bridge, and to and fro walked the captain and chief mate. Presently, I heard voices on deck. They were back from their search. "He's not down there," one of them shouted. The skipper leaned over the bridge rails. "You are on the wrong tack, I guess," he shouted back. I wish they were, thought I, and at that moment I heard their footsteps coming up the gangway towards me. I held my breath. They flashed their lanterns about. One of them nearly brushed against me as I watched. A pain shot through my head. My God, I was done for. I clapped my hand to my mouth to save myself and muffle the sound. With a smothering throb, it came. I gave forth a tremendous sneeze. It betrayed me. In an instant, I seized the wooden grating by the bridge gangway and leaped to the lower deck. I heard the crashing and throbbing of the engines. As for a moment, I stood by the galley porthole and resolved on the next step. Gripping the grating tightly, I clambered onto the bulwark and dived into the Pacific. I felt the thunder and swirl of the screw as the revolving blades just missed me, and I was sucked down by the churning waters. Still clutching the grating, I came up to the surface and, resting my arms on it, gazed at the ship. She was still thundering on, fading under the stars. I saw her go, racing away. Evidently, they had not dreamed that I had jumped overboard. The cool waters refreshed me considerably. For a long while, I could see the masthead light of the ship, and then I was alone at sea. Daybreak crept over the world of waters, and like a flood of fire, the sunrise burst up through the sky. Like a speck I bobbed about. Flocks of seabirds sighted me and hovered overhead, then came down, their legs hanging loosely, as they tried to peek my eyes out. I beat about with my hands. As I got onto the grating, seeing that I was alive, they shrieked and wheeled away. The hot sun rose. I became delirious with thirst, and unable to help myself, drank seawater. At sunset I half fell asleep as I lay on the grating, my legs in the water. I cursed that sneeze that had placed me in such a plight. In the night the moon rose. I was raving with delirium. Somehow that sneeze became embodied in human shape. My delirious imagination saw it. There in the shivering moonlit water it swam round me. Nearer and nearer its grinning, demon face came. It seemed frog-like and half-human. Dressed in a small red plush coat, it hissed at the grating and peeped at me with blue human eyes. I watched the universe crashed overhead. I waited my opportunity. It came. I seized that sneeze by the throat, tripped and squeezed the life out of its vile body, then flung it back into the moonlit waters. Once again it turned and came swimming back towards me, climbed up and grinned at me. Once more I gripped it and threw it over the side. It disappeared, and the dark fin of a gray-nosed shark slowly rose. Reality crept into my brain. I pulled my legs up onto the grating, which was awash with my weight. I waited for death and shouted. I knew that Finn was real enough, and only a miracle could save me. And it did, for my cry was heard. A passing schooner spotted me across the night, and Bones there threw the rope that saved me. Right enough, said Bones, as he knocked the ash from his pipe. Then all the hands filled their mugs with rum and clinked them together, and the contents, with one swallow, disappeared. Such were some of the various experiences I heard from the lips of those men. Almost everything connected with the organization had an exciting history attached to it. From pretty Mabau to the tall hat that hung on a peg by the emergency barrel. I think I will tell you the history of that hat just as I heard it from Bones. It appeared that in earlier days, before Bones had made the hiding profession into a fine art, and one which easily amassed wealth, his means of running the show and replenishing the food and rum casks were not as kindly and humane as the arresting scheme, with the final relief of the victim on getting his bribe, accepted a bribe that often astonished Bones by its generosity. For the shabbiest fugitives were generally the richest and the guiltiest. Well, to proceed, that immaculate tall hat had brought the organization in much money. When trading ships called in at Shuva and the surrounding isles, Bones would go aboard and negotiate for the part purchase of the general cargo, and he did well. For, though he or his representative had no ready money, they would manage to dupe the skipper or supercargo by giving them a false bill, or an IOU from some firm of repute, who knew nothing whatever of Bones and his clever crew. Attired in a frock coat and that tall hat, they commanded the necessary trust and respect. Galloway, the Yankee who worked the business personally, managed to get a surprising amount of credit. Scores of harmoniums, musical boxers, and miscellaneous clothes were got hold of through the Yankee's smartness. The whole business was run on fine strategic lines. After a good deal, Galloway would lie low and lend the hat and frock coat to a confederate. Soon, however, in spite of their care, a breath of suspicion blew across the South Seas. Skippers told each other to look out. "You see that hole in the rim of the hat?" said Bones, pointing his thumb to what looked like a bullet hole. "That deedy place cost me a cool £1,000. Then, you see that hole, don't you? Well, when Galloway's pal went aboard a schooner in Lake Mba, he stands on deck and makes a deal for 500 clocks. Natives would give their souls for a clock and 1,000 tins of meat stuff. In fact, almost everything that we wanted. Well, he gives the skipper his IOU, seemingly made out and signed by a settler who was well known for his wealth and integrity in Fiji. But, as he stood on deck and signaled to the natives, overside to bring the boats alongside to take the first load of stuff away, the skipper, who had previously been done, spied the same hole in that tall hat which he had noticed when Galloway duped him. So he says, "Before you take the stuff away, have a whiskey," and then says, sudden like, "You've got your pal's old hat on. What's become of him?" "I've still got his IOU." Galloway's pal at this looked uncomfortable, and the skipper kept the ball rolling, for he whips a revolver out of his pocket. And as H bolts over the side, the old curse fires. Bang! H's ear was blown off. So ended the IOU trade, and H left those parts with his ear missing. Then he made a fortune through kidnapping native girls in the Solomon and Marquesan groups, and got on so well that he purchased a schooner, and 10 years ago called this way and invited us on board. As we drank in the saloon aft, we heard the general cargo of naked native girls and youths wailing under the floor decks as they called for grub. I took mercy on half a dozen girls next morning as H got them on deck and paraded them for my inspection. I bought them and sold 3 to the sailors of a German man-o'-war, and their missionary gave me a good price for the other 3. So Bones rambled on, telling me much, which I have left out as being unprintable and worse too true to enlarge upon. The traffic in native girls for immoral purposes was common in the early days, and still is today, but it is carried on now by more disguised methods. Indeed, most of the crimes that were rampant in the old days are worse than ever, for they are carried on with deeper guile, as missionaries, earnest men enough, leave the sorrow and sin of their own lands to spread hypocrisy over the South Seas. For the natives are clever, and with education simply learn the duplicity of the white race. Loudly they sing the low-to hymns as they grin in their hearts over the change in things for the better. Now I am approaching the end of my stay in Fiji. I had my few belongings packed, for I had been promised a berth aboard the frigate Bird, that lay in Suva harbor and was due to leave in a few days. It had been a swelteringly hot day. I had told Mabel that I was going away, and from her learnt that Vichuo had completely thrown her over and was much in love with the white woman who had stayed at Suva. Tears gleamed in her eyes as she realized that I should soon be going, and as I sat and played the violin to the men who had befriended me while I was hard up, she looked up at me like a whipped dog, with beseeching eyes, and I felt very sorry for her. At sunset I walked with Bones under the cocoa palms down by the river. It was to be my last night. The smell of the decaying ferns and rotting oranges in the jungle grass came in sweet, damp drifts as the cool evening breeze sprang up. In the trees a few birds sang, and from far off came the sound of the tribal drums beating the sunset out, and the stars to the skies, over the native village a mile away. I had the night before been to Narendrao, to bid farewell to the old missionary. He had crossed his hands on his breast and blessed me, then laid his hands on my shoulders, gazed into my face and said, "Farewell, my son. The blessing of God be with you." I left him as a son would, a father, with sadness in my soul for his age. And in my sorrow I seemed to hear a noise beating in my heart, like toiling shovels, that day by day deepened his grave. As I stood by the river slope with Bones, we heard the paddling of a canoe, and round the bend came a bow to wish me farewell. She appeared very excited as she jumped ashore. Early moonrise bathed the pool waters as she stood beneath the palms, and to our surprise said, "Vituo is dead. I kill him." As she told us this, she lifted her hands to the sky and wailed. We tried to calm her, but it was no use. We only gathered that Vituo, her faithless lover, had died by her hand. Still I can see her figure, mirrored in the water of the moonlit pool, as she wailed, swaying her blood-stained hands and singing a death chant that sounded like this when translated. "O winds of night, I call, across the hills of sleep. Let my bow to silence fall, forever into sleep." Then gazing over her shoulder, she rushed off into the jungle, and Bones and I hurried after her. Through the trees we saw her running. Then she reached the sea. "What's she up to?" said Bones, as we sighted the shore. Out on the edge of the promontory, like some carved goddess, she stood, appealing to the skies with lifted arms as she wailed a primitive note of sorrow. Moonlight revealed her stricken, dusky face. Up went her arms for a moment in perfect stillness, then she dived. Bones and I rushed over the reefs. Neither of us had time to think that she might take her own life. Stumbling into the shallow water by the rocks, we reached the promontory and the spot where she went in. I dived and Bones followed me. Round and round we swam, moving the liquid depths, as the imaged stars twinkled and faded. "Mabao," we called. Then we each dived, scrambled and felt for her. No sight or sign of life appeared. The dark waters had taken her young life away. An hour later Bones and I crept back to the den, wretched and sad. We did not speak. We still had a faint hope that she might have swum round the promontory point, eluded us, and be still alive. I could not sleep, and at daybreak we started off together. As we reached the fatal spot, sunrise was creeping over the Pacific. Out on the extreme edge of the promontory, we stood side by side and looked down into the clear depths, searching. For on the water floated her reedy, made from a pretty piece of colored silk, a present to her from the white girl who had stayed at the organization room. I knew it had been worn to please Vituo, whose despicable conduct had caused his own death and that of Mabao. Suddenly Bones said, "Look," and pointed for a moment. I hardly dared to gaze at the spot where he pointed, and then in perfect silence we looked. On the sandy bottom, deep down in the water, by a boulder of red and white coral, was Mabao, her eyelids apart as she stared fixedly up through the clear, crystal depth. The first sunbeam stained the water by her brown figure. The South Sea's wild blackbird sang joyously in the cocoa palms, and the sails of the outbound schooner that caught the tide faded on the horizon. At sunset next day, I bade Bones goodbye and sailed on the frigate Bird. For 3 months, I sailed among the islands in a trading schooner and then left it at Hivawe, where I stayed for 3 weeks. I was a bit downcast, and employed my time by hard study on the violin. There was an old wrecked schooner on the reefs, and at night I used to creep down into her hold and practice. I was ambitious to be a great violinist. For a while I was in my element in that ship's hold, and then the natives heard my fiddle wailing and were frightened out of their lives, thinking that the wreck was haunted by evil spirits. I was innocent enough of it all as I played away night after night, until, looking through the porthole in the bright moonlight, I heard a jabbering noise and saw hordes of natives on the beach, watching and creeping about as I played. Then a man came aboard the wreck and shouted down the hold, "Hello there," and told me that all his hired natives were packing up and leaving for other islands, as they all thought when my violin wailed that the old wreck was haunted by spirits of heathen gods. So I lost my chance of being alone with my aspirations in the South Seas, and once more got a schooner and went off to Honolulu and other islands. I managed, by being careful, to save some money from my ship and musical engagements, for I was abstemious, and devoted my spare time to music and reading. I made several acquaintances among the crews of the ships that traded among the islands, many of whom were young Englishmen who had left the mailboats and the deep-sea liners to earn more money on trading boats and see the islands and the Australian cities. I also got to know many German and colonial sailors. The North German Lloyd mail ships arrived in Sydney weekly, and the hands would leave and get jobs on the small boats running to Samoa and elsewhere in the Pacific Isles. I've learned that time changes, men, but greed never sleeps. The calm waters may hide darker depths, and success often carries the ghost of those left behind. Watching these once desperate sailors, now drinking in luxury, reminds us that fortune is never free, it always takes its toll. Every toast echoes with the memory of the sea that made and broke them. True wealth, perhaps, lies not in gold, but in what we can live with when the waves are silent. And now, please enjoy the next part of the story. About a month after the foregoing incidents took place, and while I was in the Marquesas group, I came across an old man who was one of those characters which are often to be met with in the wild outer spaces of the world. He lived not far from the shoreside at Nuka Hiva, and was an enthusiastic astronomer. His lone homestead was by the lowest peak of some hills, and so situated that it was eminently suitable for the purposes for which he required it, which were rest, reading, and quiet. An unobserved observation of the starry skies, whereat for hours, with hopeful eye fixed at the telescope, he would gaze on cloudless nights. Night after night, while the traders and natives slept, the solitary old man would sleeplessly follow his hobby. The wild poetry of primeval nature surrounded his hut home. The swinging seas thundered or softly broke over the reefs below, and clumps of pandanus trees and cocoa palms like Jolian harps caught the wandering winds and wailed mournfully. They were and are wild places, and the scattered isles were as oases on the vast Sahara of the Pacific Ocean. Duhai was the nearest primitive capital, where strange races mingled and traded. Inland lived the old tribes, the survivors of cannibalistic days. Those old tattooed Marquesan chiefs sat by their conical dens, chewed modern plug tobacco, and smoked opium, and looked upon the calaboose as the final resting place for reflective age. In the villages, the natives grew copra and tropical fruits and sold them to the French, who formed the greater part of the white population. They wore the reedy and still encouraged old tribal customs, and the native women and girls, though modest and virtuous, were often ruined, body and soul, by the Chinamen who sold them opium and did many other things. Wild Gilbert, for that was the name we knew, the astronomer Bai had left his native land and lived this lonely life, was a mystery that no one bothered about. One thing was certain, he was no myth, and was there. We all liked him. Originally, he must have been a tall man, but age had bent his backbone and reduced his height by about 2 inches. His unkempt gray beard gave him a patriarchal aspect, and his deep-set clear gray eyes, fine, lofty brow and kind expression, revealed no hint of inward vice. The native Marquesan servant who tidied his one room once a week was old and wrinkled, being over 70 years of age. Photographs pinned on the wooden wall of his bedroom imaged the refined faces of relatives, one of them, a sad-faced young girl. Solitary Gilbert was respected by the white community of the district, a community which chiefly consisted of traders and cast-ashore sailors of various nations, and represented the adventurous stock of England, Scotland, and France, 1 or 2 Mongolian niggers, and a full-blooded celestial who did their washing and spent the proceeds on Marquesan ladies, who wore few clothes, worked on the various plantations, chatted and chewed. The traders used to congregate in the grog shanty, which was run by a jovial Libra from Noumea, the convict settlement, tell their various experiences and argue over the latest Marquesan politics, or murders, and also express their various views of the local missionaries, who had long since given them up as hopeless atheists. Drinking beer till their teeth floated seemed to be the height of their ambition, though a few hoped to realize by trading enough money to go back to their native land. They were jovial men. Some had sailed the 7 seas, and some had hurriedly emigrated direct to the South Seas, and only thought of their country in troublous dreams. But all of them positively refused to give up their wild ways, listen to the missionaries, and live a sweet and beerless life. Only one man had a magnetic influence for good over them, and that man was the mysterious old astronomer, Gilbert. I came to know the lonely star watcher well. Often, while I was sitting in the grog shanty, listening to the traders arguing, he would walk in and talk and lecture them, and they listened with profound respect. When excited by the thrilling subject of his conversation, the stars' aged lips trembled and revealed the sensitive temperament of a lofty imagination. Something in his manner and in his earnest voice made us all lift our eyes and attention to him. Every night he would bring his telescope under his arm and, perching it outside on a beer barrel, get the traders, each in turn, to fix their eyes to the lens and gaze at the heavens. We all liked the wise old man, and from him I learned all that I know of the stars and their travels through space. Once the old fellow was laid up with a chill, and lay for 2 or 3 days in bed. I did my best for him as he sat up in his bunk, attired in a red nightshirt, looking ill and solemn, and passing the time by talking philosophy. Schopenhauer was his pet subject when he could not gaze at the stars. He gave me his books, but though I made a great mental effort, I only succeeded, after reading the books, in discovering that I knew nothing, that life was nothing, that creation was a tremendous black nothing wherein human eyes continually opened and shaped all that is, that stars flashed out of the same human consciousness that imagined pain, passion, and all the arts and emotions which beautify the imagined universe. As I knew little at that time of philosophy, old Gilbert found me an appreciative and quiet listener, who did not argue on any point. Indeed, I became fond of him, and so, through respect for his memory, I am now attempting a short biographical note of his existence. Music he loved, and I would play the violin to him. Old and staid as he was, when I played softly and tenderly some old melody, his voice would join tremulously in, and, though pathetically toneless, outrivaled a master voice by its sincerity. Poetry he liked, and beyond his table and one old chair and bunk bed, his furniture consisted of 2 long shelves of classical books. Through him my mind was enlarged, till I realized that pianissimo, legato and staccato cadenza, and music's mysterious charm, vaguely expressed, but did not fathom, the serious ideals of life, were only as a wailing, wandering wind of the mind, stirring the soul and the flowers of memory, as they sighed through the emotions, a breath on the deep waters of thought. Yes, that solitary old astronomer friend of my youth, though I did not realize it then, revealed to me that literature and poetry were great and beautiful music fused in the white heat of thought's spiritual flame, and for that alone his memory is ever dear to me. Notwithstanding his virtues, the missionaries looked upon him as an old madman, and he in turn gazed upon them with intense pity. The storekeeper hard by, who sold everything from a needle to tinned meat, was a deeply religious man, and trusted everyone but Gilbert. I remember him well. He was determined to be just and right, spoke often about God and divinity, with a voice that rang with the note of justness, and sounded like the clink of government. He did well in his store shop, and I think he would have weighed a gift of the widow's mite carefully before she left his premises. One night he was discovered dead, and Ah Fu, the Chinaman, suddenly left the district. Though the crack in the storekeeper's head was put down to a fall, we had our suspicions. The traders cursed the storekeeper's death, because Ah Fu did their washing, and they had now to fall back on the native girls, who only wore reddies and grass and could not resist the temptation of such finery, and so often they wore our shirts and collars and underpants for weeks before returning them, and if they secured admirers, they sometimes eloped into the forest with them, and our washing was seen no more. So though the islands were made a paradise by cocoa palms, tropical fruit trees, sea-beaten reefs, and inland mountains, they had their drawbacks. Gilbert used suddenly to appear in the grog shanty, quietly sit on a tub, look round, critically scan the rough, unshaved faces of the traders, and then say, "Boys, beer may be well, and doubtless has its advantages, but do you ever think of the skies, the vastness of space, with its myriads of worlds, endless sunsets and sunrises, sparkling through infinite gloom? At this they would wipe their mouths with the back of their hands and gaze awestruck at one another, each seeking to hear a reply from the other. For the word infinity had something in it that outwitted their comprehension. The oldest and biggest scoundrel of the lot would look the most earnest and, after placing his quart pot on the shanty bench, slowly wipe his bearded mouth and say, "Professor, we do think of them ere marvelous things. Nights and nights they worries us when we thinks of the vast abscess abyss called space." Then old Gilbert, encouraged, would once more proceed and say, "Like unto thee, space hath no end, and the stars, which are as the dust of heaven, eternally roll out blue days and sunsets for endless myriads of worlds that are sparkling through infinite space. Yet, O men, are thy souls immersed in no more than the fumes of beer." At this the trader would get argumentative and say, "What's the end of space? And if you're go to the end, where would your fall if you fell over?" "O man of beer," old Gilbert answered, delighted to have got up a controversy over his pet hobby, "your thoughts cannot out-travel the range of your intellect. You but surmise an end. Because your intellect hath an end. Thou art finite, and the heavens infinite." And after saying this, which was Greek to them all, he brought forth his telescope from under his coat. Each one outside under the clear tropical skies would glue his curious eye to the end of the tube and gaze at the orbs of space. And so the professor spent his time, and gradually induced in the rough traders a genuine love of astronomy. They all got really to like him, and listened eagerly to all he said. And often they ceased their drinking bouts and saved their money when their trading ships came in from the scattered isles of the North and South Pacific. Many nights down the slopes they went like obedient children, following old Gilbert in single file. As they walked along looking up at the stars, towards Gilbert's observatory, they surrounded him. In a ring on the lonely hill at midnight, they listened to his lecture, gazed through his old Herschelian telescope at the seaward stars and the moon, and then looked into each other's eyes, astonished, saying, "Wonderful mates. All them air worlds, like this air," and the professors found Gilbert would stand on the beach, proudly gazing upon his sinful rough pupils, as the sea wine stirred his gray beard, and his deep-set eyes shone as they probed him with questions, not to please him, but from intellectual curiosity. Afterwards he granted them all one final drink of rum. When he died he was buried in the little railed-in plateau, where also lay the dust of exiled white men and a few Marquesan chiefs of the old times, who slept quietly in that silent cemetery by the mountains. When the traders stood by old Gilbert's grave, and slowly lowered the coffin down, tears were in the eyes of even the worst of them. He had made them better men, and through his little telescope tube, which pointed to the heavens, he had put into their hearts thoughts on the grandeur of creation and reverence for God's wonderful work. So Gilbert lived, toiled, and died, the sincerest and most successful missionary of the far South Seas. About a month after the foregoing incidents took place, and while I was in the Marquesas group, I came across an old man who was one of those characters which are often to be met with in the wild outer spaces of the world. He lived not far from the shoreside at Nuka Hiva, and was an enthusiastic astronomer. His lone homestead was by the lowest peak of some hills, and so situated that it was eminently suitable for the purposes for which he required it, which were rest, reading, and quiet. An unobserved observation of the starry skies, whereat for hours, with hopeful eye fixed at the telescope, he would gaze on cloudless nights. Night after night, while the traders and natives slept, the solitary old man would sleeplessly follow his hobby. The wild poetry of primeval nature surrounded his hut home. The swinging seas thundered or softly broke over the reefs below, and clumps of pandanus trees and cocoa palms like Jolian harps caught the wandering winds and wailed mournfully. They were and are wild places, and the scattered isles were as oases on the vast Sahara of the Pacific Ocean. Duhai was the nearest primitive capital, where strange races mingled and traded. Inland lived the old tribes, the survivors of cannibalistic days. Those old tattooed Marquesan chiefs sat by their conical dens, chewed modern plug tobacco, and smoked opium, and looked upon the calaboose as the final resting place for reflective age. In the villages the natives grew copra and tropical fruits and sold them to the French, who formed the greater part of the white population. They wore the reedy and still encouraged old tribal customs, and the native women and girls, though modest and virtuous, were often ruined, body and soul, by the Chinamen who sold them opium and did many other things. Why old Gilbert, for that was the name we knew, the astronomer Bai had left his native land and lived this lonely life, was a mystery that no one bothered about. One thing was certain, he was no myth, and was there. We all liked him. Originally, he must have been a tall man, but age had bent his backbone and reduced his height by about 2 inches. His unkempt gray beard gave him a patriarchal aspect, and his deep-set clear gray eyes, fine, lofty brow and kind expression, revealed no hint of inward vice. The native Marquesan servant who tidied his one room once a week was old and wrinkled, being over 70 years of age. Photographs pinned on the wooden wall of his bedroom imaged the refined faces of relatives, one of them, a sad-faced young girl. Solitary Gilbert was respected by the white community of the district, a community which chiefly consisted of traders and cast-ashore sailors of various nations, and represented the adventurous stock of England, Scotland, and France, 1 or 2 Mongolian niggers, and a full-blooded celestial who did their washing and spent the proceeds on Marquesan ladies, who wore few clothes, worked on the various plantations, chatted and chewed. The traders used to congregate in the grog shanty, which was run by a jovial Libra from Noumea, the convict settlement, tell their various experiences and argue over the latest Marquesan politics, or murders, and also express their various views of the local missionaries, who had long since given them up as hopeless atheists. Drinking beer till their teeth floated seemed to be the height of their ambition, though a few hoped to realize by trading enough money to go back to their native land. They were jovial men. Some had sailed the 7 seas, and some had hurriedly emigrated direct to the South Seas, and only thought of their country in troublous dreams. But all of them positively refused to give up their wild ways, listen to the missionaries, and live a sweet and beerless life. Only one man had a magnetic influence for good over them, and that man was the mysterious old astronomer, Gilbert. I came to know the lonely star watcher well. Often, while I was sitting in the grog shanty, listening to the traders arguing, he would walk in, and talk and lecture them, and they listened with profound respect. When excited by the thrilling subject of his conversation, the stars' aged lips trembled and revealed the sensitive temperament of a lofty imagination. Something in his manner and in his earnest voice made us all lift our eyes and attention to him. Every night he would bring his telescope under his arm and, perching it outside on a beer barrel, get the traders, each in turn, to fix their eyes to the lens and gaze at the heavens. We all liked the wise old man, and from him I learnt all that I know of the stars and their travels through space. Once the old fellow was laid up with a chill, and lay for 2 or 3 days in bed. I did my best for him as he sat up in his bunk, attired in a red nightshirt, looking ill and solemn, and passing the time by talking philosophy. Schopenhauer was his pet subject when he could not gaze at the stars. He gave me his books, but though I made a great mental effort, I only succeeded, after reading the books, in discovering that I knew nothing, that life was nothing, that creation was a tremendous black nothing wherein human eyes continually opened and shaped all that is, that stars flashed out of the same human consciousness that imagined pain, passion, and all the arts and emotions which beautify the imagined universe. As I knew little at that time of philosophy, old Gilbert found me an appreciative and quiet listener, who did not argue on any point. Indeed, I became fond of him, and so, through respect for his memory, I am now attempting a short biographical note of his existence. Music he loved, and I would play the violin to him. Old and staid as he was, when I played softly and tenderly some old melody, his voice would join tremulously in, and, though pathetically toneless, outrivaled a master voice by its sincerity. Poetry he liked, and beyond his table and one old chair and bunk bed, his furniture consisted of 2 long shelves of classical books. Through him my mind was enlarged, till I realized that pianissimo, legato and staccato cadenza, and music's mysterious charm, vaguely expressed, but did not fathom, the serious ideals of life, were only as a wailing, wandering wind of the mind, stirring the soul and the flowers of memory. as they sighed through the emotions, a breath on the deep waters of thought. Yes, that solitary old astronomer friend of my youth, though I did not realize it then, revealed to me that literature and poetry were great and beautiful music fused in the white heat of thought's spiritual flame, and for that alone his memory is ever dear to me. Notwithstanding his virtues, the missionaries looked upon him as an old madman, and he in turn gazed upon them with intense pity. The storekeeper hard by, who sold everything from a needle to tinned meat, was a deeply religious man and trusted everyone but Gilbert. I remember him well. He was determined to be just and right, spoke often about God and divinity, with a voice that rang with the note of justness and sounded like the clink of government. He did well in his store shop, and I think he would have weighed a gift of the widow's mite carefully before she left his premises. One night he was discovered dead, and Afu, the Chinaman, suddenly left the district. Though the crack in the storekeeper's head was put down to a fall, we had our suspicions. The traders cursed the storekeeper's death because Afu did their washing, and they had now to fall back on the native girls, who only wore reddies and grass and could not resist the temptation of such finery, and so often they wore our shirts and collars and underpants for weeks before returning them. And if they secured admirers, they sometimes eloped into the forest with them, and our washing was seen no more. So though the islands were made a paradise by cocoa palms, tropical fruit trees, sea-beaten reefs, and inland mountains, they had their drawbacks. Gilbert used suddenly to appear in the grog shanty, quietly sit on a tub, look round, critically scan the rough, unshaved faces of the traders, and then say, "Boys, beer may be well, and doubtless has its advantages, but do you ever think of the skies, the vastness of space, with its myriads of worlds, endless sunsets and sunrises, sparkling through infinite gloom?" At this they would wipe their mouths with the back of their hands and gaze awestruck at one another, each seeking to hear a reply from the other, for the word infinity had something in it that outwitted their comprehension. The oldest and biggest scoundrel of the lot would look the most earnest, and after placing his quart pot on the shanty bench, slowly wipe his bearded mouth and say, "Professor, we do think of them ere marvelous things. Nights and nights they worries us when we thinks of the vast abscess abyss called space." Then old Gilbert, encouraged, would once more proceed and say, "Like unto thee, space hath no end, and the stars, which are as the dust of heaven, eternally roll out blue days and sunsets for endless myriads of worlds that are sparkling through infinite space. Yet, O men, are thy souls immersed in no more than the fumes of beer?" At this the trader would get argumentative and say, "What's the end of space? And if your go to the end, where would your fall if your fell over?" "O man of beer," old Gilbert answered, delighted to have got up a controversy over his pet hobby, "your thoughts cannot out-travel the range of your intellect. You but surmise an end, because your intellect hath an end. Thou art finite, and the heavens infinite." And after saying this, which was Greek to them all, he brought forth his telescope from under his coat. Each one outside under the clear tropical skies would glue his curious eye to the end of the tube and gaze at the orbs of space. And so the professor spent his time, and gradually induced in the rough traders a genuine love of astronomy. They all got really to like him, and listened eagerly to all he said. And often they ceased their drinking bouts and saved their money when their trading ships came in from the scattered isles of the North and South Pacific. Many nights down the slopes they went like obedient children, following old Gilbert in single file, as they walked along looking up at the stars, towards Gilbert's observatory. They surrounded him. In a ring on the lonely hill at midnight, they listened to his lecture, gazed through his old Herschelian telescope at the seaward stars and the moon, and then looked into each other's eyes, astonished, saying, "Wonderful mates. All them air worlds, like this air." And the professors found Gilbert would stand on the beach, proudly gazing upon his sinful rough pupils, as the sea wine stirred his gray beard, and his deep-set eyes shone as they probed him with questions, not to please him, but from intellectual curiosity. Afterwards he granted them all one final drink of rum. When he died he was buried in the little Railden Plateau, where also lay the dust of exiled white men and a few Marquesan chiefs of the old times, who slept quietly in that silent cemetery by the mountains. When the traders stood by old Gilbert's grave and slowly lowered the coffin down, tears were in the eyes of even the worst of them. He had made them better men, and through his little telescope tube, which pointed to the heavens, he had put into their hearts thoughts on the grandeur of creation and reverence for God's wonderful work. So Gilbert lived, toiled, and died, the sincerest and most successful missionary of the far South Seas. About a month after the foregoing incidents took place, and while I was in the Marquesas group, I came across an old man who was one of those characters which are often to be met with in the wild outer spaces of the world. He lived not far from the shoreside at Nuka Hiva, and was an enthusiastic astronomer. His lone homestead was by the lowest peak of some hills, and so situated that it was eminently suitable for the purposes for which he required it, which were rest, reading, and quiet. An unobserved observation of the starry skies, whereat for hours, with hopeful eye fixed at the telescope, he would gaze on cloudless nights. Night after night, while the traders and natives slept, the solitary old man would sleeplessly follow his hobby. The wild poetry of primeval nature surrounded his hut home. The swinging seas thundered or softly broke over the reefs below, and clumps of pandanus trees and cocoa palms like Jolian harps caught the wandering winds and wailed mournfully. They were and are wild places, and the scattered isles were as oases on the vast Sahara of the Pacific Ocean. Duhai was the nearest primitive capital, where strange races mingled and traded. Inland lived the old tribes, the survivors of cannibalistic days. Those old tattooed Marquesan chiefs sat by their conical dens, chewed modern plug tobacco, and smoked opium, and looked upon the calaboose as the final resting place for reflective age. In the villages, the natives grew copra and tropical fruits and sold them to the French, who formed the greater part of the white population. They wore the reedy and still encouraged old tribal customs, and the native women and girls, though modest and virtuous, were often ruined, body and soul, by the Chinamen who sold them opium and did many other things. Why old Gilbert, for that was the name we knew, the astronomer by had left his native land and lived this lonely life, was a mystery that no one bothered about. One thing was certain, he was no myth, and was there. We all liked him. Originally, he must have been a tall man, but age had bent his backbone and reduced his height by about 2 inches. His unkempt gray beard gave him a patriarchal aspect, and his deep-set clear gray eyes, fine, lofty brow and kind expression, revealed no hint of inward vice. The native Marquesan servant who tidied his one room once a week was old and wrinkled, being over 70 years of age. Photographs pinned on the wooden wall of his bedroom imaged the refined faces of relatives, one of them, a sad-faced young girl. Solitary Gilbert was respected by the white community of the district, a community which chiefly consisted of traders and cast-ashore sailors of various nations, and represented the adventurous stock of England, Scotland, and France, 1 or 2 Mongolian niggers, and a full-blooded celestial who did their washing and spent the proceeds on Marquesan ladies, who wore few clothes, worked on the various plantations, chatted and chewed. The traders used to congregate in the grog shanty, which was run by a jovial Libra from Noumea, the convict settlement, tell their various experiences and argue over the latest Marquesan politics, or murders, and also express their various views of the local missionaries, who had long since given them up as hopeless atheists. Drinking beer till their teeth floated seemed to be the height of their ambition, though a few hoped to realize by trading enough money to go back to their native land. They were jovial men. Some had sailed the 7 seas, and some had hurriedly emigrated direct to the South Seas, and only thought of their country in troublous dreams. But all of them positively refused to give up their wild ways, listen to the missionaries, and live a sweet and beerless life. Only one man had a magnetic influence for good over them, and that man was the mysterious old astronomer, Gilbert. I came to know the lonely star watcher well. Often, while I was sitting in the grog shanty, listening to the traders arguing, he would walk in and talk and lecture them, and they listened with profound respect. When excited by the thrilling subject of his conversation, the stars' aged lips trembled and revealed the sensitive temperament of a lofty imagination. Something in his manner and in his earnest voice made us all lift our eyes and attention to him. Every night he would bring his telescope under his arm and, perching it outside on a beer barrel, get the traders, each in turn, to fix their eyes to the lens and gaze at the heavens. We all liked the wise old man, and from him I learnt all that I know of the stars and their travels through space. Once the old fellow was laid up with a chill, and lay for 2 or 3 days in bed. I did my best for him as he sat up in his bunk, attired in a red nightshirt, looking ill and solemn, and passing the time by talking philosophy. Schopenhauer was his pet subject when he could not gaze at the stars. He gave me his books, but though I made a great mental effort, I only succeeded, after reading the books, in discovering that I knew nothing, that life was nothing, that creation was a tremendous black nothing wherein human eyes continually opened and shaped all that is, that stars flashed out of the same human consciousness that imagined pain, passion, and all the arts and emotions which beautify the imagined universe. As I knew little at that time of philosophy, old Gilbert found me an appreciative and quiet listener, who did not argue on any point. Indeed, I became fond of him, and so, through respect for his memory, I am now attempting a short biographical note of his existence. Music he loved, and I would play the violin to him. Old and staid as he was, when I played softly and tenderly some old melody, his voice would join tremulously in, and, though pathetically toneless, outrivaled a master voice by its sincerity. Poetry he liked, and beyond his table and one old chair and bunk bed, his furniture consisted of 2 long shelves of classical books. Through him my mind was enlarged, till I realized that pianissimo, legato and staccato cadenza, and music's mysterious charm, vaguely expressed, but did not fathom, the serious ideals of life, were only as a wailing, wandering wind of the mind, stirring the soul and the flowers of memory, as they sighed through the emotions, a breath on the deep waters of thought. Yes, that solitary old astronomer friend of my youth, though I did not realize it then, revealed to me that literature and poetry were great and beautiful music fused in the white heat of thought's spiritual flame, and for that alone his memory is ever dear to me. Notwithstanding his virtues, the missionaries looked upon him as an old madman, and he in turn gazed upon them with intense pity. The storekeeper hard by, who sold everything from a needle to tinned meat, was a deeply religious man and trusted everyone but Gilbert. I remember him well. He was determined to be just and right, spoke often about God and divinity, with a voice that rang with the note of justness and sounded like the clink of government. He did well in his store shop, and I think he would have weighed a gift of the widow's mite carefully before she left his premises. One night he was discovered dead, and Ah Fu, the Chinaman, suddenly left the district. Though the crack in the storekeeper's head was put down to a fall, we had our suspicions. The traders cursed the storekeeper's death because Ah Fu did their washing, and they had now to fall back on the native girls, who only wore reddies and grass and could not resist the temptation of such finery, and so often they wore our shirts and collars and underpants for weeks before returning them, and if they secured admirers, they sometimes eloped into the forest with them, and our washing was seen no more. So though the islands were made a paradise by cocoa palms, tropical fruit trees, sea-beaten reefs, and inland mountains, they had their drawbacks. Gilbert used suddenly to appear in the grog shanty, quietly sit on a tub, look round, critically scan the rough, unshaved faces of the traders, and then say, "Boys, beer may be well, and doubtless has its advantages, but do you ever think of the skies, the vastness of space, with its myriads of worlds, endless sunsets and sunrises, sparkling through infinite gloom?" At this they would wipe their mouths with the back of their hands and gaze awestruck at one another, each seeking to hear a reply from the other, for the word infinity had something in it that outwitted their comprehension. The oldest and biggest scoundrel of the lot would look the most earnest, and after placing his quart pot on the shanty bench, slowly wipe his bearded mouth and say, "Professor, we do think of them ere marvelous things. Nights and nights they worries us when we thinks of the vast abscess abyss called space." Then old Gilbert, encouraged, would once more proceed and say, "Like unto thee, space hath no end, and the stars, which are as the dust of heaven, eternally roll out blue days and sunsets, for endless myriads of worlds that are sparkling through infinite space. Yet, O men, are thy souls immersed in no more than the fumes of beer? At this, the traitor would get argumentative and say, what's the end of space? And if your go to the end, where would your fall if your fell over? O man of beer, old Gilbert answered, delighted to have got up a controversy over his pet hobby, your thoughts cannot out-travel the range of your intellect. You but surmise an end, because your intellect hath an end. Thou art finite, and the heavens infinite. And after saying this, which was Greek to them all, he brought forth his telescope from under his coat. Each one outside under the clear tropical skies would glue his curious eye to the end of the tube and gaze at the orbs of space. And so the professor spent his time and gradually induced in the rough traders a genuine love of astronomy. They all got really to like him and listened eagerly to all he said. And often they ceased their drinking bouts and saved their money when their trading ships came in from the scattered isles of the North and South Pacific. Many nights down the slopes they went like obedient children, following old Gilbert in single file. As they walked along looking up at the stars, towards Gilbert's observatory, they surrounded him. In a ring on the lonely hill at midnight, they listened to his lecture, gazed through his old Herschelian telescope at the seaward stars and the moon, and then looked into each other's eyes, astonished, saying, wonderful mates. All them air worlds, like this air, and the professors found Gilbert would stand on the beach, proudly gazing upon his sinful rough pupils. As the sea wine stirred his gray beard, and his deep-set eyes shone as they probed him with questions, not to please him, but from intellectual curiosity. Afterwards he granted them all one final drink of rum. When he died he was buried in the little railed-in plateau, where also lay the dust of exiled white men and a few Marquesan chiefs of the old times, who slept quietly in that silent cemetery by the mountains. When the traders stood by old Gilbert's grave, and slowly lowered the coffin down, tears were in the eyes of even the worst of them. He had made them better men, and through his little telescope tube, which pointed to the heavens, he had put into their hearts thoughts on the grandeur of creation and reverence for God's wonderful work. So Gilbert lived, toiled, and died, the sincerest and most successful missionary of the far South Seas. The Adventures of a Wanderer follows the remarkable life of a young man who leaves behind the narrow expectations of society and chooses the wide, unpredictable world instead. With nothing but a violin on his back and a restless heart in his chest, he drifts from ship to ship, island to island, meeting kings, missionaries, fugitives, war veterans, wandering sailors, and the forgotten souls of the Pacific. His journey takes him through the South Seas, where he witnesses both the beauty and brutality of human life, the innocence of island children, the fading traditions of ancient tribes, and the haunting loneliness of missionaries who have given up everything for a calling no one else understands. Along the way, he encounters poverty, danger, betrayal, fleeting love, and unexpected friendships, each chapter revealing more of the world and more of himself. What makes his story unforgettable is not the exotic landscapes or the dramatic episodes, but the narrator's unfiltered honesty. He observes life with the eyes of a poet and the heart of a survivor. He sees the dignity in the poor, the hypocrisy in the powerful, and the quiet heroism in ordinary people. Every person he meets becomes a lesson, every island a mirror, every adventure a test of who he is becoming. At its core, this book is about freedom, integrity, and the search for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unjust. It reminds us that true wisdom doesn't come from society's rules, but from lived experience, listening, wandering, helping, and daring to feel deeply. Most of all, it teaches that a wandering life is not a wasted life, it's simply a different path toward understanding what truly matters.